Oh, hi, folks. You're with us today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to sort of do a brief exploration of the definition and meaning and application of the word freedom. I mean, is it purely a sentiment, or is it something that can be accurately defined and applied? Where does freedom fit in? I noticed when I was looking at images to put in the thumbnail that pretty much all the images were of people or creatures like birds or something in cages, and the cage was being opened and they could be free. Now, the concepts of freedom sort of vary considerably. If we're going to look at freedom in terms of the liberties people have, then have they come from a situation where they've never known liberty, and in which case, how can the same level of deprivation of liberty when they move to another place be an expression of their lack of freedom? So freedom has developed as a concept, at least, or a sentiment, has developed quite differently across the world in different places and for different reasons and levels of practicality. For example, there's a huge carry on about black slavery, but it's focused exclusively on the transatlantic slavery, not all the many other ways that black people from Africa were being enslaved, whether it be by Arab slave traders or indeed neighbouring African tribes. The idea of slavery was as common and as usual and typical in African society as drinking water if you're thirsty. That's how it was. So to say that black people from Africa were being denied their freedom by being brought to in this case, the Americas or the Caribbean and that sort of thing. Why weren't they then also being denied freedom when they were enslaved in Africa by neighbouring tribes or by Arab slavers? Well, why is it uniquely only a denial of freedom if it's one type of slavery, even though it was clearly a denial of freedom under all circumstances? So how do we define freedom or lack of it? And how do we then apply freedom and it in the real world and on the ground to whether it be groups of people or individuals or animals or anything? How do we understand freedom? And what we're just looking at freedom or its interpretations. There's no even small group of interpretations that I can find. There's sort of an emotional vision of freedom as somebody in a cage and chained who breaks the chains and escapes into in the sunlight, out of the darkness into the sunlight, and they're free. And it's certainly part of the American sort of shtick, particularly the propaganda after the Revolutionary War. When the level of taxation that the new nation needed to impose on its citizens was vastly greater than the taxation that the British were looking at imposing on the colonists at the time. So this was obviously looked at as, gee, this is not going to go down well with the people. They're paying more taxes than the British wanted. Wow, what's the justification for the revolution? Well, the justification wanted. Wow, what's the justification for the revolution? Well, the justification is freedom, and that was really a modern sort of, if you like, birthing of the concept of freedom. In that case, though, it was the idea of the more tax you want to impose upon us, the more we want to have a say in how the government is run, which is not unreasonable, by the way. But the British terms were hardly outrageous, and I don't think anyone would perceive them as outrageous. They were, I don't know, what would you call it, an encumbrance on the colonial elite of the time, and they're the ones that really drove that sort of struggle with Britain, which was really more a civil war, I think, than anything else. But the British colonists fighting the British government in London. So, but anyway, the freedom is interpreted in many different ways. So the idea of the black slaves in America, they want to be free from ownership by those evil white people. But then they move on to land that they have to buy, and then they have to go into debt to do it, and they're struggling to pay those debts, and things that were being paid for by the plantation owners, such as accommodation and food and all those things. Now these people have to supply it for themselves. So they're burdened by a different set of onerous obligations, which are equally crushing to freedom as the slavery might have been. So again, we see the interpretations of freedom changing. Freedom is having the vote. Being denied the vote is a lack of freedom. Is it a freedom of choice? Is it a freedom you can express in some way? Your single vote alone won't decide the government or who sits in the government. So to what extent is your freedom? So is it freedom in the aggregate or freedom in the totality? So these are all things of freedom. Now there was a big discussion about this it's come along at various times in history, discussions about it sort of in the late 1800s. And this was around, say, universal franchise and voting. There were talks about, the extension of the vote for younger people, or the extension of the vote for what at the time would have been considered lower middle class or working class, and so on. So there was an extension of franchise that was considered as being symbolic of freedom rather than a freedom per se. And there was a lot of literature around it back in the time, again, the 1890s, looking at that freedom at a conceptual level and looking at its role in as was very much the phrases and sayings of the time of looking at it in a concept of within space and time. This was particularly poignant given the speed at which transport was what had taken for a trip that had taken 4 months or 17 weeks 50 years, 60 years earlier was now being done in 5 weeks, and these sort of things were wow. It had a real wow factor, and also things like refrigeration were changing the entire concept of food distribution and supply chains. So there's a lot of this idea of that humans were being freed from the tyranny of distance, the tyranny of time, the tyranny of space. So there's a lot of talk about that then. Move, say, now to the late 1960s, early 1970s, and we see there's a different concept of freedom. And I know some of you may know there's a song, you can get it on YouTube. It's a song written by Chris Christopherson and I think Fred Foster, and it's called Me and Bobby McGee. And it was made into quite a big hit by the singer Janis Joplin in, again, I think 1969, 1970, somewhere around there. And one of the lines in the song is freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. So when you own nothing and you have nothing other than the shirt on your back, you're free to go anywhere and do anything you want, or anything you can. That doesn't mean, well, I've got the freedom to go anywhere I want. I can be a brain surgeon tomorrow. That's freedom. No, it's not that. For the freedom that you're not tied to a place, you're not tied to. You're not in a situation where what you own, the things that you own, start owning you. So you're so busy and desperate to protect them and stop others from getting at them. So too busy polishing them and so on, that these things that you own end up owning you, which is a very real thing, by the way. And the more gadgets and bits and pieces you acquire, the greater the cost and the effort and time you have to put into maintaining them and keeping them, and thus your freedom in terms of the other time you have to do other things is being robbed. You're being imprisoned by that concept of ownership. Now, so the freedom of is just another word for nothing left to lose. Has a lot of resonance, and it was quite a big thing if you look at that sort of hippie generation and the flower power type people around there. That was very much a thing. that if you if you own nothing and you're tied to nothing, you've got no relationships, then you have nothing to lose, and therefore you have, if we use a form of deductive reasoning, you therefore have freedom. But then you're imprisoned by other things, being that you have nothing. Therefore, your freedoms are restricted because you don't have enough money to act with complete discretion as to what you do and where you go, and whether or not you sit down for that, at the fancy restaurant, or whether or not you have takeout food to some greasy little shit heap along the who are quite well to do, and they've got many freedoms. They own their property. They've got the swimming pools, and they've got this, they've got that. They've got the freedom and the income. And if we define freedom by the amount of income or spare cash or whatever, your assets, then that's a different matter. But they can have these lavish vacations and so on. Yet they feel imprisoned. That they to talk to them and listen to them, you'd think that they had no freedom. So the freedoms that they have, they take for granted that's the natural order of things, and then they look at the things that they want that don't have, and therefore they would see that they don't have complete freedom, or on the balance of it all, they don't have more freedoms than restrictions. So how do we define these? Our laws, for example, the laws saying you can't kill or you shouldn't steal, or do they restrict our freedoms? So now, if we look in the Western world, and I'll use Britain. Britain is an interesting case in terms of developments of freedom because of the stability and continuity they enjoyed over such a long period of time. So freedoms were able to develop there because the classes in charge felt confident enough of their position that they were prepared to concede freedoms, whereas the governments, whether they be aristocratic or not, in Europe, where there was mainland Europe, where there was constant warfare and invasions and this, that, and the next thing, they were much less inclined to concede what would be considered as liberties and freedoms. Liberties and freedoms actually are two different things as well. We can even go down that path. But say in Britain, you walk around these country lanes there, and you find these things called a public footpath. Now, it was a lot. You had to take miles and a lot of time walking around, say, an aristocrat's property, if you wanted to get to a village or a town or something like that. So it was devised that there would be a public footpath that would walk right through the middle of this aristocrat's cornfields or wheat fields or cows grazing, whatever it was, that would give you a direct line to the little village or the settlement or the town or whatever the case may be. So it was done for very practical reasons, but these were liberties that existed in Britain or England that didn't exist elsewhere. So if you look at the liberties that an English citizen had, say in the year 1700 as an example, they had a surprising number of liberties that we take today for granted, but a surprising number of liberties that they didn't have in mainland Europe. Now, you'd have patch in some places, they'd have this liberty but not that. But if you look at all the liberties that were and the freedoms around at the time, then the English had that were and the freedoms around at the time, then the English had a surprising number of freedoms, and therefore had an higher expectation of their role in society and the duties and obligations they had to that society. So this brings us to another aspect of freedom. If you're obliged to I don't know, give some of your time each week or each fortnight or something to some public cause, is that a denial of freedom, or are you giving freedoms to others through your contributions? Now, if we look at capitalism says, well, you have choice, and you can choose to do this. You can choose to work hard at school or work hard at your job, or you can choose to become I don't know, a carpenter or go and work in a bank or whatever. You get to choose these things to a large extent, at least. Now, to some people, I say, well, that choice. If I make a choice and put my time into that, I then don't have the time to go and make another choice or a different choice if choice A doesn't work out. So by having choice, I'm placed under I'm forced to make a decision, and being put in a position of having to make a decision is in fact a denial of freedom, or dilutes my freedom, because it doesn't work out. I then can't do, or it's too late, or I spent too much time doing option A. I therefore had to do option B. Thus, I lose I in effect have lost a freedom rather than gained it if I make a wrong choice or an unfortunate choice. Therefore, having choice or multiple choices is a denial of freedom, or is a false freedom, in as much as I can't be guaranteed a success. I don't know which door to go through that has the magic pudding at the other side, or the prize on the other side of the door. Therefore, the stress involved and the risk involved in having choice is in itself a denial of freedom. So, I mean, that's one perspective, and you do see the point. I mean, suppose you go into I had this once actually. I got I won as a kid. I won some prize, something that I had, to get one bar of chocolate, or one candy bar, or a certain amount of money to buy a confectionery, and it was at a certain confectionery shop. So I went along, and then when I saw, okay, you've got, for example, $1 to spend. You can have any chocolate bar, any candy bar you want. So, what a kid! You go, whoa, holy shit, this is great. And then I get to the candy shop and the chocolate shop, and and I remember as a kid, I couldn't make the decision which one will I get. I can have any one I want, but suddenly now I've got such a broad choice that it was a stressful, anxiety-provoking moment as a kid. Which one would I get? I mean, what if I get that one? But maybe there was a better one. And I think that's part of it's seen in some quarters a loss of freedom. Now you look at the communist sort of societies where you don't own anything other than your personal effects, the shirt on your back, that sort of thing. Or your car maybe, but everything, all the means of production and all the property is owned by the state. So the argument is that you are freed from the capitalist system of having to own something, or needing to own something, paying rent to a landlord, or any of that sort of thing. And because you're freed from those constraints, and you're freed from those who would exploit you, you therefore have a freedom that those poor schmucks in the capitalist system don't have. You are thus free. You are freed from that oppression. The same when they were trying to get Soviet Russian women to leave the farms and go and work in the shitty dirt floor factories. They would say, well, you're being freed from the chains of the kitchen. You're being chained to the kitchen. You're being oppressed. Go and work 12 hours a day in that shitbox fucking dirt floor factory. Get treated like shit by bosses, and that's actually going to be freedom. And of course, that was absolute and utter nonsense. But that was the idea that freedom can be achieved simply by swapping. Assuming we even accept its oppression, and I'd argue that you swap one oppression for another, and therefore you've gained freedom. I mean, that's nonsense. You've gained absolutely nothing. And if you look at again in the Soviet system, they tried to avoid market fluctuation type stuff for foodstuffs and so on, but the reality was that the rents that people were paying in the sort of level of rent they were paying to landlords under the Tsarist system, this is before the communists took over, was often cheaper than, or lower price for rent than it was when the communists took over. So the communists needed the money themselves, so the rent all went to the communist, the Communist Party, or the state. Consolidated revenue or exchequer, or call it what you like, but the money went there, and they needed the money. And even though they'd acquired the property for free, and their upkeep of the property was pretty ordinary, they still still were charging, what in effect would have been commercial level rents. And even used that as a device to force people to work. Let's put the rent up by 50%, and that'll force these women into the work, to go and work at the factory, because they're going to need the income to be able to pay the rent. So it was used quite cynically, in my view, there. So I don't think they gained any freedom. The courts were then very arbitrary. It's just that they weren't aristocrats that were running it. The lowest peasants, the people that sort of the poorest 1/3 of society did end up getting a better deal out of communism than they otherwise would have. But again, it's swapping one form of oppression from another. Instead of living in a rural household and having a high quality of life, they had to move to the cities, and everyone in the family had to work. And sure, they had things that they probably wouldn't have had in the rural areas, but a lot of that was due to advances in tech. They had things that they probably wouldn't have had in the rural areas, but a lot of that was due to advances in technology anyway. So they had theoretically more freedoms, but again, it was swapping one form of oppression for another, and for a much lower quality of life. The women could work optionally in the farms, and so on, other family members, other than bringing in the harvest or something. Whereas once they're in the city, they have to work 6 days a week. That's how it is. They have to attend school for a certain. So really, they're just changing oppressor. So again, it's that freedom. Now, if you look at what the globalists are talking about, you'll own nothing and be happy. So it's more towards the communist end of the rationale equation, where the globalist, World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and that sort of stuff, where they're saying, well, we'll make all the decisions for you. You'll have a little cubicle. We'll let you live in a little cubicle. We'll allocate you enough food, but anything you need to own or need to access, any service or any item, whether it be a mixing machine for your kitchen, for the kitchen, or whatever it is, you'll have to rent it from us. We will monopoly own everything. So that's clearly that's really having a small cabal of oppressors controlling everything you do. That's hardly freedom, but they're selling it as freedom in as much as, look, you don't have to make any decision. You want to do anything, we will completely order your life, what you eat, the amount of nutrition in what you eat. We will make all these decisions for you. You'll be freed from having to make any decisions. You will merely exist. And that is what we will call freedom. So we're looking at a whole new set of definitions for freedom. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. You've been with Tacitus today and your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.